So to help us understand why we might end up being part of one political team or another, we're going to introduce the concept of a psychological frame. The idea is that we see the world through frames. And these frames, what they do for us is they help us give meaning to the complexity of the social world, right? So they help us interpret the world. They impose a kind of order and structure onto what otherwise might be sort of a chaotic, dynamic processes in society. The frames help us sort of detect and identify what's fair in the social world, right? So who's deserving in the social world, what's a threat, what counts as success, what can be changed in society. These would all be types of questions that relate to our framing of the social world. A particular frame will identify one set of relations as fair and a different set of relations as unfair. A frame of viewing the world will determine who's deserving in that world and who is not. A frame will help us identify what is a threat, what is not a threat, what counts as success or not, what can be changed, etc. So the idea is we kind of see the world through these frames. You might think of them as glasses, filters. We see the world through a filtered prism, right? And so the nature of the filter then, of course, determines sort of how we're seeing the world. Now, if we are seeing the world through these frames, it means that people might have different frames through which they see the world. And that's why they might have different answers to the question, what's fair, who's deserving, etc. Now, how is it that people could have these different frames? Well, we have to think about what these frames are. So let's take a look. The idea here is that these frames are cognitive structures, and they reside in our minds, in our brains more specifically. And they would be things like the concepts that we have learned through socialization, the principles, the values that we have embraced, the metaphors we use to understand things. Right? And so we can have multiple frames depending on what aspect of society or what kind of judgment we're making. But again, these frames help us give order and structure to the world. Now, if frames are in part installed by socialization, then of course it raises the possibility that different types of socialization will install different frames. And so people who have been socialized in different ways might come to see the world in a different way. When we accept and install certain frames, of course that also means that we are rejecting other frames, other ways of seeing the world. Now, we can still, as an exercise of our imagination, imagine what it is like to see the world through a frame that we reject. But nevertheless, what we're going to say here is that the frames that we endorse, these are the ones that we use to see the world, although we can imagine what it's like to see the world through other frames. So, one major hypothesis as to where these frames come from is this long period of socialization. And as we are maturing, we are learning all kinds of things from our parents and peers and society at large and our own experiences. And so this socialization process then might tilt the balance between whether we're going to have frames of the world that coincide with a liberal political worldview, or frames that invite us to see the world through the more conservative worldview. So the socialization hypothesis is, of course, an obvious one, but there's another possibility here, and that is more along the lines of a sort of a genetic predisposition to see the world in one way rather than another. And here the idea is that each of us is born with a certain set of genes. Of course, we had no control over that, but that's the fact. These genes influence the development of our brains, and the development of the brains includes all kinds of neural systems and the interconnectivity between these systems that might predispose us to adopt certain frames rather than other frames. Right? So on this view, yes, of course, there's still socialization, but our genetic inheritance, the equipment that we start out with, right, the original structure of the brain and its associations might make some frames more hospitable here and others more likely to be rejected. And we'll capture this with the concept of personality. So personality has been shown to be highly heritable, right, indicating that variations in personality can be correlated to variations in genes. And so the idea then is that our particular set of frames that we might have is a complex interaction between our socialization, which might expose us to different frames, and our personality that makes certain frames easier to install, you might say, and other frames easier to reject, or more likely to be rejected. Now, we'll get into this in a little later, but here are some examples of some of the personality differences that are associated with the two political teams that we've been discussing, the liberal and the conservative. In terms of personality traits, if we think about the conservative individuals, research by John Jost and others has shown that conservatives tend to have some of these personality characteristics. Preference for social order and stability, tolerant of inequality, avoidance of ambiguity, high fear of threat and death, high system justification. We'll talk about what system justification is a little later. So the idea here again is that on the personality view, as we are maturing, sure, we're exposed to all kinds of different arguments and values and principles from our parents and teachers and culture and our own experiences and so on. But because of our genetic inheritance, because of the conservative's genetic inheritance, the conservative might have brain systems that are a little different than the brain systems of the typical liberal. So just to take a couple of aspects of this, maybe their disgust circuitry is a little different. Maybe the empathy systems are a little different. Maybe the fear systems are a little different. And these genetic predispositions might be influencing what types of frames get installed in the conservative's mind. And so here we see sort of cartoonishly here the growing conservative is sort of rejecting the liberal worldview, right? That brain, the conservative brain, is less hospitable to liberal frames of seeing the world. The personality differences here will nudge, will tempt the developing person to adopt a more conservative worldview. On the other hand, there are other people in the world who have inherited different sets of genes and who have different fear systems and empathy systems and disgust systems. And some of these folks, as they mature, they might have a different sort of experience where they tend to reject conservative frames and embrace liberal frames, right? And again, the idea is that socialization and personality may be interacting to influence one's sort of worldview as one matures. The typical liberal has the following personality traits associated with them: tolerant of social change, inequality aversion, so they don't like inequality, open to experiences, tolerant of ambiguity, less fear of threat and death, and low system justification. So again, in sum, the idea is that depending on your genetic inheritance, your personality may sort of steer you towards a conservative worldview or a liberal worldview. But it is the interaction of socialization and personality that may be key factors in what worldview you end up with. Now, just a quick note about these political worldviews. If you're thinking, well, maybe you're not such a political person, or what does it so much matter what worldview one has? Well, some recent research on couples has revealed a striking fact about couples. Political attitudes are some of the strongest shared traits among couples. People place more emphasis on politics, religion, and social activity when choosing a mate than they do physical appearance or personality. So, recent research is showing that as we mature and start trying to find our partners in life, one's political views are a very important factor in judging whether one person or another is going to be somebody that you'll be compatible with. There is a term here, researchers call this mate sorting, that when we go looking for our long-term mates, we're talking about, one's social and political attitudes and views is an important criteria in deciding whether we're going to spend a long time with that person or not. Now, once we identify with a team, right, so liberal or conservative, researchers have found that we show biases in information processing. We're going to call this motivated reasoning. Here are some elements of motivated reasoning. We preferentially seek information and arguments that support our position, whether it be liberal or conservative. We ignore, attack, or denigrate arguments that weaken our position. And researchers have documented that this comes very easily to us. And again, we'll call this motivated reasoning. Now, motivated reasoning is not strictly rational, right? Because the old idea of reasoning was that, well, we reason in order to arrive at the truth, to get at the truth. But in the case of motivated reasoning, what seems to be going on is that people are doing motivated reasoning to protect one's own view rather than getting at the truth. And so this is not rational behavior, but it is something that humans often and easily engage in. Now it raises questions, well, why is this? Well, again, the classical view was that we are the rational animal, right? Reasoning helps us discover the true beliefs. But in a new view, what we'll call the social evolution view, reasoning did not evolve to find the truth or the valid inference. Rather, thinking is for social doing. People are intuitive politicians. They strive to maintain positive identities with multiple constituencies. And this means that people are going to be eager to defend one's action when faced with social criticism. And people are also intuitive prosecutors. They're highly motivated to detect cheaters, free riders, and other rule breakers. So the idea is that we are using our reasoning powers for social ends, not for discovering the truth. So we'll be seeing that many examples of biased reasoning, but this biased reasoning has political implications. So because reasoning has a social function, then the power of an argument or the use of an argument may depend on the nature of prior emotional commitments to groups, institutions, and social practices, as well as implicit associations, right? So researchers in this field, they see time and again examples where people are not being persuaded by facts and good arguments because they are defending their worldview against some threatening facts and arguments. So they're not trying to get at the truth. They're not updating their beliefs based on reasoned arguments and evidence and so on. They are defending their view and their team's view. And what this means then is that the particular status of an argument or its persuasive power is not just a matter of sort of rational aspects, but rather we have to take into consideration the emotional attachments people have to various groups and institutions. If an argument is threatening one's group or institution or social practice, then and one is associated with these groups and institutions, then one is going to defend oneself against these arguments, even if the arguments would be powerful on a purely rational basis.